Yes, you hear that right. They are called floaters. So it doesn't have any blood vessels, and instead it gets all of its nutrients from your tears, which sounds really sad. This is all highlighted in this image. As you can see, this would be the image that one of your eyes collects if the brain didn't do any processing. Hello, it's Ryan and welcome back to the channel. We've had a bit of a hiatus, but we're back and we're back with a bang. Today, we're going to be talking about the path that light takes through the eye. And then we're going to be understanding how the eye creates an image and how the brain creates an image and how we perceive the world using our eyes. Light entering the eye would first encounter the cornea. Now the cornea is the transparent part of your eye that sits just on top of your iris and your pupil. Now if you look into my eye, the iris is the colored part of the eye and the pupil is the black spot in the middle. So the cornea is over the top of those. Its main functions are to, first of all, protect parts of the eye, so protects the iris and the pupil, but one of its main functions is to help us to create an image. What it does is it refracts light. We talked about it in the rainbows video. It's the process where light bends as it comes across a different medium. Don't worry too much about that though. So light entering the eye would hit the cornea and it would be refracted or bent to focus it slightly so that the lens, which we'll talk about in a second, has an easier job at creating an image. And a fun fact about the cornea, it's one of the only parts of the body that don't have any blood supply. Now, if you had blood vessels in your cornea, it wouldn't be transparent and therefore it wouldn't be able to do as good a job as it does currently at refracting light into the eye. And so this could affect how we see, and it could affect our vision. So it doesn't have any blood vessels and instead it gets all of its nutrients from your tears, which sounds really sad, but also from oxygen in the ear. So it gets its oxygen from air, and then when you blink, you give the cornea nutrients from tears. Once past the cornea, light will enter the pupil. Now the pupil is the little black spot in your eye by here. And what it does is it aids us, or it allows us to see better in darker and lighter or brighter situations. So it dilates in darker situations to allow more light into the eye, and in brighter situations it constricts to allow less light into the eye. You'll actually notice this as well. Next time you're in a room with somebody else, look into their eyes, not lovingly, just look into their eyes and notice the size of their pupil. Flick the lights off, wait a couple of seconds to allow your pupils to dilate. Flick the lights back on and again look into their eyes, and you should notice a change in the size of their pupils. So it should have dilated and got bigger, and then when the lights came back on, it should constrict and get smaller again because there's more light in the room. So next time you fancy looking at this, or if you're home bored right now and you want to try and investigate the pupil dilation, go and do that. It's quite a cool little thing to do. Anyway, this dilation and constriction of the pupil is governed and is controlled by the iris, which is the colored part of your eye. I have brown eyes, so mine is brown. But the color of the iris is determined by the amount of melanin pigmentation within it. So people who have more melanin pigmentation will have darker colored eyes. So I obviously have a lot because I have brown eyes. And people who have a little or less amounts of melanin pigmentation will have brighter eyes or lighter eyes. So blue eyes, green eyes, they have less melanin pigmentation than people who have brown eyes like myself. Once through the pupil, light will come across the lens. Now the lens works with the cornea to refract light correctly onto our retina. The cornea already does a large amount of the refraction, as I said earlier on, and it refracts the light onto the lens. The lens will then refract light onto the retina, which allows us to form an image, but we'll talk about that in a second. Now one question you might have is, how do we see things closer up and how do we see things further away? Well, this is because of the lens. So in order to see things closer up or further away, our lens is able to thicken itself or make itself thinner so that it can refract light in different ways. Closer up objects require a thicker lens because there's more refraction needed in those situations. The lens does this in an amazing way. It's surrounded by something called the ciliary muscle. And this muscle can tighten or constrict, which in turn changes the thickness of the lens. The ciliary muscle is connected to the lens via the suspensory ligaments. Let's assume you're focusing on Bob, who's a very long distance away from you. The light coming from Bob will first of all be refracted by the cornea, as I mentioned before. Now, because the cornea will have done a large amount of the work, and because of the distance, the light does not need to be refracted as much. Therefore, the lens doesn't need to be as thick. The ciliary muscle will then relax and its diameter will become thicker. This will then cause the suspensory ligaments to tighten and pull the lens thinner. Now the lens needs to be thinner because there doesn't need to be as much refraction because of the distance that the object or bob is away from us, and so there will be less refraction required and therefore a thinner lens needed. Now in the opposite scenario, when bob is very, very close to us, the opposite is true. So the cornea will still do the same amount of refraction, but because bob is a lot closer to us, more refraction is required by our lens for us to focus the object or focus bob. As a result, we need a thicker lens. Now in order to achieve this, the ciliary muscles will constrict and their diameter will go thinner. This will cause the suspensory ligaments to loosen and allow the lens to go back to its thicker state, its more circular, thicker state. Because, as I said, bob would be a lot closer, the light would require a larger amount of refraction, and therefore the thicker lens would be required in order to focus the light on the retina. One other thing to note is the light focused by the lens is also inverted. So again, let's take the scenario with bob. The light coming from bob's head would be refracted by the cornea and also refracted by our lens. So light would be bent to the point where it would appear as though bob's head is where his feet are and bob's feet are where his head is. This would mean that the retina would interpret the image as inverted or upside down. Once past the lens, light then travels through the space between the lens and the retina. Now this space is filled with fluid known as the vitreous fluid or the vitreous humour. The vitreous humour is made up of predominantly water, but it also contains salts, proteins, sugars and collagens as well. Its main role is to protect the eye by ensuring that the eye remains spherical and keeps its spherical shape, and it also pushes against the retina so it keeps the retina in place as well. The vitreous humour is also the part of the eye where you find floaters, and yes, you hear that right, they are called floaters. Now they are the stringy things that you see in your vision every now and again floating around in your eye, hence the name floaters. So these are shadows that are caused by microscopic fibers clumping together in the vitreous humour. These become more common with age and are a result of the vitreous humour becoming slightly more liquid. Generally though, there is no need to worry about these unless you see a large amount of them appearing all at once and flashes in your vision. If that's the case, go and find your eye specialist and have a chat with them. But generally, if you see floaters in your vision, it's not anything to worry about too much. So once through the vitreous humour, light then reaches the retina. Now I've mentioned the retina before in this video, but I'm going to talk about it in a bit more depth right now. The retina is the part of the eye that is responsible for receiving the light and converting that light into a neural signal, which our brain can then understand and interpret. It's made up of two different types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Now you've probably heard of rods and cones before. Rods are the parts of our vision that are predominantly found in the peripheral vision. They're more sensitive to general luminance or general light and are colorblind, so there is no color receptors on the rods. Because of their sensitivity to general luminance and light, they are more useful in the dark, and the fact that they are colorblind and have no color receptors is the reason that we don't see color in the dark. So that's why when you're in a dark room, you can't distinguish different colors between them unless some light comes into the room. Cones, on the other hand, are predominantly found in the fovea, or our central vision. They're a lot more sensitive to fine details and they are color coded, which means the reason we see color is because of the cones. Remember that visible light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and within the visible light portion of the electromagnetic spectrum is all of the colors that make up visible light. So each color has a different wavelength of light. Now the cones in our eyes are coded to a specific wavelength of light. So each cone is sensitive to a different wavelength of light or a different color. The rods and cones are found at the back of the retina, and light that gets to the retina must travel through a few layers of cells before it reaches the rods and cones. This means that the retina is kind of inside out and is part of the reason that we have a blind spot, but we'll get to that in a second. As mentioned previously, the retina converts the light information into a neural signal, which our brain can interpret. This then must travel from the eye to the brain in some way. Now it does this using the optic nerve. The area where the optic nerve connects to the eye is known as the optic disc, and is the only part of the retina that has no rods or cones, and therefore no light information can be collected there. So a dark spot in our vision where we can't see any information. As such, this area of our eye is not able to detect information, and this leads to our blind spot. So that is the path of light through our eye. You might be wondering then, why don't I see my blind spot? Or why have I got colour in my peripheral vision when you just told me I shouldn't have colour in my peripheral vision? Well, this is because of the brain. The information that leaves the eye through the optic nerve goes to the visual cortex of the brain, and processing occurs there. So the brain takes all of this information and it irons out the kinks so that we can see more clearly. So firstly, it inverts the image that our eye collects so that we see the world the way that it should be. And actually there's evidence, or there's the thought anyway, that babies don't actually see the world the right way up for a few days of their life. Because their brain hasn't figured out that it's meant to flip it over yet. So after a couple of days, the brain works that out and then starts to flip the world for babies so they see everything the right way around. The brain also fills in the gaps left by our blind spot. And I'm going to show you this in a second with an experiment, which we'll do just at the end of the video. This is all highlighted in this image. This would be the image that one of your eyes collects if the brain didn't do any processing. As you can see, there is only colour in the fovea, or central part of our vision. There is no colour in the peripheral parts of our vision because of the aforementioned colour-blind rods in that part of our vision. The peripheral vision is also not as detailed as the central vision, which is also because of the differences between rods and cones. Finally, the image is upside down and there is a black spot where the optic disc lies. So without our brains to do all of this image processing, we wouldn't be able to see the world as we see it, and we would in fact see it similarly to that image. Okay, let's do an experiment to find our blind spot. What we're going to do is I'm going to show you 3 separate images on this video. And what I want you to do is pause the video when you see the images. I'll give you a couple of seconds countdown before I'll continue with the video. And I want you to try out the experiment for yourself. For the first image, what I want you to do is close your left eye, focus on the cross or the plus on screen, and move your head closer to the screen until the dot vanishes. Once the dot on the right hand side disappears, you have found your blind spot. The brain can no longer see that dot, and so it disappears. Pause the video now and give it a go. Okay, the second experiment we're going to do includes colour. So you should have a plus and a dot on your screen. The plus has a green background, the dot a yellow background. What I want you to do is the same thing as before. Close your left eye and focus on the plus on screen. As you move your head closer to the screen, you should notice the dot disappears and instead your brain fills it in with yellow. Now this is because the brain notices the yellow background that's in that part of the image and makes the assumption that the dot should be yellow as well. And so it fills in the blind spot with that yellow color, thinking that it needs to fill it in. Pause the video now and give that a try. Okay, so the final experiment we're gonna do involves dots and a cross again. This time, I want you to do the same thing. So close your left eye and focus on the cross and move your head closer to the screen or farther away if you're very, very close to the screen. What you should notice is the dots on the right hand side, one of which is not red. When you find your blind spot, that dot that isn't red will turn red. And the reason for this is the brain notices the pattern with all of the red dots on screen. And it then makes the assumption that the other dot, which is within your blind spot, should be red. And so it shows you the red image. Pause the video now and give that a try. Okay, I hope that has blown your mind as much as it blew my mind when I tried this the other day. Leave a comment below with how blown your mind is, because I just think that is one of the coolest things that our brain does. And be sure to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video too. For now though, I'll see you in the next one.